Good evening. I was just getting ready for bed, took off my makeup, put on these highly glamorous pajamas, and decided that now is as good a time as any to do some reading together. It's not particularly glamorous. My laptop setup with its terrible microphone is nothing impressive, but I want to share reading with people, so that's what I'm going to do. We are going to be reading tonight the first couple of chapters of The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry. It's a spooky book, but the bits that we're going to be reading aren't scary, so do not worry. Let's get started. Okay. Harry, before. She remembered falling in love with movies when she was very young, remembered disappearing into the dark with only the flickering screen to guide her. She remembered the feeling of drifting away from the seat and the small bag of too salty popcorn and into the movie as the restless sounds of her mother and father and sister shifting and coughing and whispering faded to another time and place that Harry had left behind. Her parents took her to very few films, and even then only films that were considered clean. While the rest of her fourth grade class chatted excitedly about Titanic, she had to content herself with occasional glimpses of clips seen during television commercial breaks. Her parents were half convinced that film and television were actual tools of the devil, and Harry and her sister Margaret, always Margaret, never Maggie, weren't allowed to see anything that had higher than a G rating. But Harry didn't care. She loved the movies, loved the drive to the theatre and the way everything smelled like hot butter and raisinets, loved watching the coming attractions before the film started and the hush of anticipation that fell when the title sequence began. Even if she was only allowed to see G movies, at least she was seeing movies. At least she was someplace besides her sober, judgmental household, a place where the only acceptable conversation was prayer and the only acceptable attitude was piety. Harry knew her family was different than other families, even different from most of the families who attended the same church. Her school friends attended Sunday school with her and went to Christian summer camp, but they also were allowed to walk the mall in small groups. They had cable television and saw rated R movies late at night after their parents had gone to bed. They had new clothes from places like the Gap and American Eagle, while Harry and Margaret were only allowed Salvation Army second-hands. Harry was 11 when she was permitted to attend her first sleepover birthday party. She'd begged her mother to allow her to go, having always been the only girl left out when she had to turn down previous invitations. For some reason, on that particular occasion, her normally stern mother relented, a decision she would likely regret for the rest of her life, because it was on that night that Harry was irredeemably corrupted. The friend, Jessica Pianansky, had an older sister named Erin who had been left in charge of the menagerie of girls for the evening, while Jessica's parents wisely went out to dinner after the birthday cake was served. Erin had been dispatched to the local video store to rent Kiefer Sutherland movies, as Kiefer was Jessica's current obsession and her bedroom was plastered with photos of him torn from Us and Entertainment Weekly and People that she'd taken from the library. Jessica always had slightly out-of-date obsessions, like she ought to have been born 10 years earlier. Erin had returned with copies of The Lost Boys and Flatliners, two films that Harry would never have been permitted to watch under normal circumstances. Her hands were sweaty as The Lost Boys slid into the DVD player, as she stared down the barrel of doing something her parents would not approve of. All around her, the other girls argued over the relative merits of Jason Patric versus Corey Haim versus Kiefer Sutherland, but Harry didn't join in. She was in love with the dark, with the Lost Boys swinging and flying under the railroad track, with the arterial spray of the first vampire attack, with the blood gushing from the sinks and splattering all over the house. She relished the thrumming of her heart, the pulse of her own blood, the terror and the splendor and the excitement she'd never felt before. When the movie was over, she felt reborn as an addict seeking another thrill. She didn't know how she would find it again, how such a visceral pleasure would ever be allowed in a home where pleasure of any kind was a sin. She began to sneakily read copies of Fangoria magazine whenever she saw them, at the corner store when she was sent out to buy milk, or at the bookstore when her mother wasn't paying attention. As she entered high school and she got a job of her own, making ice cream cones and sundaes at Dairy Queen after school, she had more time and money to do what she liked, to stop and buy those copies of Fangoria on the way home and ferret them away between her mattress and box spring, taking them out only when everyone else in the house was asleep and scanning the pages, flashlight in hand, seeing hints of worlds where she wasn't permitted to travel, places where regular people were flesh-eating cannibals, or writers accidentally opened portals to terrible universes, or alien creatures stalked a prison world. She wanted more. She always wanted more, and more, and more. But it wasn't until she made her escape, when she became Harry Adams and left Harriet Ann Score behind forever, that she could have all the terror she wanted, and then some. Chapter 1. It was the size of the house that got Harry every time she saw it. Of course, she'd seen houses that size before, in certain neighborhoods around Chicago, giant houses whose sheer enormity should have relegated them to the suburbs. This city house wasn't a McMansion, though, one of those classless boxes bulging oversized dwellings for those who wanted to display their money, or at least their debt. It was decidedly not new, not the province of some futures broker or investment banker. It had the same greystone face as her own 2-flat apartment building, a 15-minute bus ride and half a world away, economically speaking. But it was twice the size. The house covered 2 lots, with a third lot for a side yard. As an apartment dweller, she didn't often contemplate property taxes, but just the fact of those 3 lots made queasy multi-digit numbers dance before her eyes. The building was 3 stories plus a basement level. The windows were tall on the lowest story, less so on the second one, and downright tiny on the topmost, giving the overall effect of slowly closing eyes if you glanced from the bottom to the top. Other than the oddly sized windows, there were no particular architectural flourishes save 2. At the northeast corner of the roof, a sculpture protruded like a Notre Dame gargoyle, a horse's head and neck carved in stone, the horse's lips pulled back, its eyes wild. All around the horse, stone flames rose, waiting to burn. Harry thought she'd grimace too, if she was trapped in fire for all eternity. In addition to the frantic stallion, there was a name carved in an arc above the door: Bright Horses. The entire property was surrounded by a 10-foot-high black iron fence. The only 2 entry points were the gate in front of her and the sliding gate in front of the garage in the back. Harry reached toward the call box so she could be buzzed in, but paused as she heard her phone chirp in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from her son, Gabe. "Forgot my chem report, it's on my desk," followed by a praying hands emoji. "Already at work," she texted back, and tacked on the woman shrugging and holding her hands up. She only worked 3 days a week, so if Gabe had tried on a different day, she might have hopped the bus and brought his report to him. Maybe. Part of her thought he needed to learn the consequences of not thinking ahead and putting the report in his bag the night before. The other part of her wanted to cut him some slack, given that it was his freshman year and the first time the kids were back at school post-pandemic, even if it was only 3 days a week. She was grateful that it was only 2 days off in-person schooling, as her unemployed spring, furloughed from her server job, never to return, coupled with overseeing remote learning for a 13-year-old with ADHD, had resulted in screaming, emotional breakdowns for both of them. Having Gabe's learning monitored by qualified teachers was a profound relief. Harry watched the reply bubbles churn on her screen until Gabe's answer popped up, a sad face emoji, followed by a shrugging boy. Noise crackled from the call box and a deep baritone voice emitted from it. Are you going to stand there all day, or perhaps you'd like to work? Harry glanced up at the camera perched on the top corner of the fence. The cameras in around the house always left her feeling uneasy, even though she understood the necessity of them. There are a few too many, in Harry's opinion, though she was careful to keep that opinion to herself. Sorry, Mr. Castillo, she said, and the gate buzzed. Sorry, that's my cat running around. Harry pushed the gate open and hurried up the walk as Javier Castillo opened the front door, watching her approach. We'll start in the blue room today, he said, as she jogged up the steps. No problem, she said, pausing in the doorway. She pulled her slippers, plain grey terry cloth scruffs, bought expressively and only used at the Castillo residence, out of her backpack, placed them on the floor in the entryway, and toed out of her sneakers one by one, sliding each foot into a slipper without ever touching the ground. Harry picked up her sneakers and carried them inside, placing them on the special shelf to the left of the doorway. No outside dirt, damp, or germs touched the floors in Bright Horses. The shelf that housed her sneakers was something like a preschooler's cubby, with a space for shoes at the bottom, hooks for bags and coats in the centre, and a top shelf for hats and other items. Harry pulled off her black windbreaker and hung it on a hook. She slid her cell phone into her backpack as Mr. Castillo watched. There was a strict no-phone policy inside the house. Violation of this rule was grounds for immediate dismissal, though she was allowed to go outside during her lunch break to check messages. Mr. Castillo held out the box of latex gloves stored on a side table behind the door. Harry pulled on the gloves, wincing a little as she did. She hated the feeling of pulling on the gloves, the way the material seemed to grab and yank at her skin. Once the gloves were actually on, she didn't mind them as much, although she still liked the moment at the end of the day when she was allowed to peel them off and let her skin breathe again. Harry adjusted her medical mask. Mr. Castillo never allowed her to remove it inside the house except in the kitchen when eating or drinking, so that all that was visible were her faded blue eyes and the bit of her forehead that showed when she pulled her pin-straight blonde hair into a ponytail. She followed him down the hallway and up the stairs to the second floor. The entry to the house was deliberately neutral. The plain grey carpet and faded wallpaper practically screamed, "There's nothing to see here." But upon leaving the downstairs hall and passing into any other room, the true nature of Bright Horses was revealed. It started on the stairway, after the first steps, when the stairs curved to the left, out of sight from anyone standing in the entryway. A large framed poster of a voluptuous blonde in a red dress hung on the wall there. A snarling cat, blood dripping from its mouth, curled over her right shoulder, and over her left were the words, "She was marked with the curse of those who slink and court and kill by night." Above her head, the words, "Cat People," floated over a clock whose hands showed midnight. Harry always smiled at this poster, as Cat People was one of her favourite films, though Mr. Castillo had hastened to point out that the poster wasn't an original print. Most of the posters that lined the wall along the stairs were contemporary copies. My cat is going crazy. Though there were a few genuine articles. The original UK quad poster for Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein, the lurid red French theatrical poster for Eyes Without a Face, a US lobby poster for An American Werewolf in London. It was slow going to the top of the stairs, as Mr. Castillo always got out of breath halfway up and had to stop. Harry didn't remark on this or offer any help. She had made the mistake of offering assistance once, saying she would fetch a glass of water. "I'm fine," Mr. Castillo snapped. "I'm just fat." Harry attributed his breathlessness to lack of regular exercise, rather than size. She knew plenty of heavier people who had no trouble with stairs because they ran or lifted weights on the regular, and plenty of thin people who tired after walking half a block. But she hadn't said this. She hadn't said anything unnecessary or even vaguely personal, because it had been her first day. She was grateful to have work again and desperately averse to jeopardizing her new source of income. Even now, more than a month later, she never said anything that might be construed as personal. She was too much in awe of him, in awe of this person who'd let her into his home. Javier Castillo had brown hair going grey, brown eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles, was on the shorter side, though not as short as Harry, who had reached 5 feet at age 13 and never grown again, and overall had the completely nondescript appearance of any random person on the block. He was the sort who would never attract attention unless you knew who he was, and would never be whispered about if he went to the grocery store, which he never did. He never went anywhere if he could help it. Because of this, very few people in his neighborhood realized that one of the world's greatest living horror directors lived among them. Javier Castillo, director and writer of 15 films, most of them visually groundbreaking, genre-defying masterpieces. His film The Monster had won the Oscar for Best Picture 5 years earlier, and swept most of the other major categories along the way, including Best Director and Best Original Screenplay. The world had waited breathlessly for the announcement of his next project. Then a shocking, unthinkable incident happened, and Castillo withdrew into his California home, and there was no mention of potential new movies while the paparazzi stood outside his house with their cameras ready for any sign of life within. I am so sorry about my cat. She is going crazy. After one too many wildfires came too close to his residence, he decided to move, somewhat incongruously, to Chicago. He packed up his legendary and possibly priceless collection of movie props and memorabilia and brought them to a cold Midwestern city where the last major urban burning was decidedly in the distant past. If it wasn't for those California wildfires, Harry would still be collecting unemployment, frantically responding to job ads with a horde of other desperate people, never hearing back, wondering how long Gabe would believe her tight smile, followed by, "Everything's going to be fine." But instead, there was this miracle of a strange and reclusive director who needed someone to help him clean his collection of weird stuff 3 days a week. And so Harry climbed up the stairs and listened to Javier Castillo huff and puff. The second floor was essentially one big room divided by a load-bearing archway. The stairs curved up to the southwest corner of this room and stopped there. The stair to the third floor was on the northeast corner, which always made Harry think of a clue board with its seemingly random staircases scattered all around. There was a black railing running along the southeast corner of the room to the top of the stairs to keep people from falling straight down the first floor stairwell. The bucket of cleaning supplies was ready at the top of the stairs. Harry and Mr. Castillo each took a long-handled duster. Mr. Castillo went to the far end of the room while Harry stared on the closest figure. The blue room wasn't entirely blue. The carpet was blue, and Harry really thought he ought to get rid of the carpet. It collected dust, and it was such a difficult room to vacuum. The wallpaper had blue flowers patterned on it, blue flowers that made Harry think of Agatha Christie's story, The Blue Geranium. Except that's not quite right, Harry thought. In the blue geranium, the colour of the flower on the wall changed to blue because of a chemical in the air. Proof of poison. Nobody was in danger of poisoning in Bright Horses. Nobody lived there except Mr. Castillo, and his props, of course, and some of those were so lifelike that Harry sometimes thought they really were watching her, just out the corner of her eye. When she'd turn, the figures would be still and glassy-eyed, the artificial pupils staring off into the middle distance, having never focused on her or anything else at all. Harry loved most of the films that the props came from, but despite this, the Blue Room in particular gave her a creepy-crawly itch on the back of her neck. She didn't know why. She knew the props were make-believe, knew they were just elements of the movie magic that she loved so much, but the feeling still persisted, a feeling of something not quite right. All the various members of the collection were posed on skeleton-like frames, so that the overall result was a museum diorama grouped according to some internal catalogue system of Mr. Castillo's devising. Harry dusted a xenomorph puppet from Alien 3, the creature's jaw extended from the head as if it was about to bite. Harry liked the Alien movies. She was a fan of most of the source material for the props littered around Bright Horses, but she had discovered, to her surprise, that she didn't like the pieces separated from their performers, didn't see the appeal of latex and foam rubber without animation. Devoid of both life and context, the costumes were nothing but shed snakeskin, a pantomime of their original intent. Harry moved from the xenomorph to a figure that had been featured in one of Mr. Castillo's films, a kind of half-goat, half-demon hybrid. In the film, A Messenger from Hell, the creature, Sten, had acted as a sort of sinister guardian to the main character, Flora. It was one of Harry's favourite movies, a transcendently beautiful piece of art that was also deeply grotesque. In other words, a Castillo film. But the first time she was confronted with the mask and costume, she found herself deeply, viscerally repulsed, barely able to look at it and unable to explain why. As Harry fluttered the duster over the face, she caught, as she always did, the faint odour of sweat and talcum powder. She had thought, on the first occasion, that this was simply the scent of the actor who'd worn the mask, lingering inside the rubber. But then she realised that was absurd, that all these pieces were specially cleaned and treated before Mr. Castillo displayed them. Of course it didn't still smell like the actor. Still, every time Harry dusted the sharp descended chin, the high cheekbones, the pointed ears, the curling horns, she was certain that the fanged mouth would curl up in a terrible smile, that the icy blue eyes would shift in her direction a moment before long-fingered hands grasped her shoulders. And every time she felt this way, she shook off her unease, recognizing it as irrational. She loved the character in the movie, and a costume and mask were just that. Empty props. They were nothing to be frightened of. On a deep level, though, she recognized that this half-belief, or maybe willingness to believe, that the mask would come to life was one of the reasons why she loved horror movies so much. She never saw the props and the fake blood and the clear unreality of it all. She was perfectly credulous, always, perfectly willing to believe in what the filmmakers put on screen. Harry never held herself away from what she viewed. She was a part of it. Harry moved on to brush the elaborate folds of the silken costume, absolutely positive that the head was tilted down, watching her as she worked, and just as equally certain that the idea was observed. She was 34 years old, well past the point in life when she was allowed to be scared of inanimate objects. Still, it was a relief, as always, to move away from the figure to the other costumes behind it, to feel the pressure of that terrible gaze lift. A number of the figures on this side of the room were also from Mr. Castillo's own films. A massive demon, red-skinned and black-clawed, an eyeless troll, the folds of its body the same texture as elephant skin, a tiny, gauzy winged fairy with terribly sharp teeth. Harry knew all the movies the props came from, loved some of them enough to have watched and rewatched over and over. She never mentioned this. She had sensed during the interview that gushing fandom would be a detriment to her job prospects, and Harry really needed the job. Her unemployment check had barely covered the rent, even though she had one of the few affordable apartments in a neighborhood that had progressed rapidly from gentrifying to upwardly mobile. Harry had been one of the few parents in Gabe's elementary school whose income didn't remotely approach 6 figures, which led to increasing embarrassment as the years passed and the financial expectations grew. First, it had been fundraising for full-day kindergarten. The state only paid for half-days, with an expected donation of $2,000 per family. It was a public school, and Harry had never had $2,000 in one place in her entire life, so she had shrugged and said she couldn't pay, and that was that. She hadn't minded the idea of Gabe in half-day kindergarten anyway, as she possessed the apparently radical notion that 5-year-olds should spend more time running around than drilling reading skills. Harry had mentioned this to another mum once, full-day kindergarten having been fully funded despite Harry's lack of contribution, and the other parent had given Harry the kind of look normally reserved for serial killers or politicians she disagreed with. It is absolutely vital that young kids get a head start on learning. Statistics show that full-day kindergarten is a predictor of future success, the mum had said. Or a predictor of future burnout, Harry had thought as the woman continued to lecture. Harry had nodded and privately vowed never to mention her personal opinion on anything school-related ever again. As the years passed, there had been one expectation after another. The yearly gala for which the wealthy and well-connected donated things like Cubs tickets and spa days and wine country vacations for auction. Harry never had anything to donate or any money to bid, so she always gave vague answers when asked about the gala and made sure she had something else to do that night. And usually she did, because unlike almost every other mum at pickup, she sometimes had to work evenings. Then there was an expected donation of $200 per family per year used towards arts and theatre programs. Harry tried to scrape this up every year, carefully saving a portion of her summer tips, since she believed schools should be about more than just math. Still, there always seemed to be some new thing to contribute to. The walkathon, the science lab, the ticket money for the yearly musical. Harry had moved to the neighbourhood because it had one of the best K-8 schools in the city, and entry was only guaranteed for residents. But the constant flood of financial requests had drained her, and the additional expectation that she had the time or the energy to volunteer in various capacities had been equally frustrating. She worked during school hours, unlike most of the Lululemon mums of Gabe's classmates, women who wore Canada Goose jackets in winter and expensive blonde highlights year-round, women who drove Lexus SUVs and spent their children's school hours taking bar classes and chatting with other mums at Starbucks. It had been hard for Harry not to resent these women and their clueless privilege, but Harry had gritted her teeth and stuck it out so that Gabe could have a better chance at one of the top high schools in the city. She had worked, before the pandemic, before everything came crashing down, at an upscalish restaurant only a couple of blocks from her apartment, a place where many of those school mums with unlimited leisure time lunched during the school week. They always gave her fake smiles while ordering their grilled chicken salads, but they left nice tips, probably worried that Harry would tell the other mums that they were cheap otherwise. So Harry fake smiled them right back and thought about Gabe. Gabe, the best kid in the world. She knew every mother thought that their kids were the best kids in the world, but in Gabe's case, she was firmly convinced it was true. Whenever Harry looked at Gabe, she felt a fierce, almost incomprehensible love inside her, a love that was sometimes painful in its intensity. Stretch my leg out. She was a bottle filled with hopes and dreams for him, tempered only by free-form anxiety that something might happen to her only, most beloved child. COVID, cancer, a bus accident, a school shooting. She never expressed these fears except to sometimes give Gabe an extra long hug before he left for school, which he patiently tolerated for a few moments before saying, "Okay, Mum." That was her cue to release him, and she would, hiding the sudden emptiness she felt with an offhand, "Be safe and learn stuff, okay, kiddo?" He would duck his head and grin and leave, and she'd fight the urge to call him back, to keep him home where the world couldn't harm him. Mr. Castillo's voice broke into her reverie. "I have several calls to make, so as soon as we're finished here, you can go upstairs. After lunch, we will tackle the first floor and basement rooms." Mr. Castillo was always present whenever Harry cleaned one of the prop rooms, and in fact he did half the work, lovingly caring for his masks and costumes and maquettes. Harry's sole purpose was to assist, for he couldn't keep everything clean on his own. But the regular rooms without film collectibles, of which there were very few, were Harry's responsibility. These included 3 bedrooms upstairs, Mr. Castillo's room and 2 guest rooms, the bathrooms on the 1st and 3rd floors, the kitchen, and what Mr. Castillo referred to as the small library. The small library was essentially a reading room on the 3rd floor, a place for him to store paperbacks that had no special monetary value. It was Harry's favourite room in the house, much nicer than the formal library downstairs. There were shelves stuffed with books stacked every which way, following no particular organisational system, and 2 big soft armchairs, each with its own side table and reading lamp. Her second favourite room was downstairs off the dining room. Mr. Castillo called it the screening room. There was a large movie screen at one end, maybe 8 feet across, and about 20 extremely comfortable chairs in rows to watch movies. He had even added a little mobile popcorn cart in the corner. It was the sort of room Harry had always wanted in her own place, except they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and there was no extra space for a broom closet, never mind anything as extravagant as a reading room or a special room to watch films. Someday, she told herself. But deep down she knew that she had been saying someday for 10 years or more, and that someday might never come. Especially if you keep working as a house cleaner, she thought, as she ran the vacuum carefully around the blue room under Mr. Castillo's watchful eye. She was grateful for the job, for the money, but it was not exactly a path to wealth or even the stability of the middle class. It just meant she worried about money every 5 minutes instead of every single second. As soon as she was finished vacuuming, she rewrapped the cord around the machine and carried it to the upstairs hallway before returning to the blue room for the rest of the cleaning supplies. Mr. Castillo had already left to make his calls from his downstairs office. He often did this, disappearing without a word and reappearing suddenly, always silent, like he was expecting to catch her goofing off, or thought that he might discover the existence of a second, secret cell phone being used to take photographs. Harry tried not to be offended by the unspoken implications. Mr. Castillo wasn't unkind, a little on the stern side, perhaps, but he was fiercely protective of his privacy. She was there to do a job, and he wanted her to do it and leave, not poke around in his things or stare out of a window. Harry understood that. Really, she did, so she tried not to feel offended by his monitoring, and mostly she succeeded. And if resentment stuck in her craw, she just swallowed it down. Resentment is a familiar meal when you can't afford contentment. Harry went into the first guest room on the right on the 3rd floor. There wasn't much to do in there, just run a duster over the furniture and vacuum the carpet. Once a week, she changed the sheets and shook out the duvet. It seemed a ridiculous waste of effort and washing water to keep the guest rooms fresh and ready for anyone arriving at a moment's notice, particularly when Mr. Castillo never even appeared to invite anyone over for dinner. Harry considered it would be much more practical to wrap the mattress in plastic until it was needed. But it was not her house, nor was it her place to make suggestions. She finished the first room and moved down the hall to the next guest room on the right. As she ran the duster over the dresser, a soft thump sounded from the far wall, seemingly coming from the room next door. Harry had expected this noise, so she didn't jump the way she had the first several times it happened, nor did she attempt to investigate its source. She hummed a little tune, the way a child might whistle in the dark to keep the monsters away. She first heard the noise maybe 2 weeks after she had started working for Mr. Castillo, and it had recurred intermittently since then. The thump came again, louder than before, but her breath and her tone remained even as she kept humming. The noise sounded once again, and she thought, not for the first time, "It sounds like someone kicking the wall." But no one lived at Bright Horses except Mr. Castillo, so it couldn't be someone kicking the wall. Likely it was just an oddity in the pipes. The old heating systems in a lot of houses made noises like that. As she exited the second guest room and crossed the hall to the small library, she kept her eyes averted from the closed door to her right, the last room on the guest room side. The door was always locked, and it wasn't her job to be curious about it. Well, how exciting! Thank you so much for chilling with me and reading a book. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to borrow books for free, make sure you get a library card. They're amazing. Support your local library. Night night.